Have you ever looked your flesh and blood in the eyes and realized you are just a bank balance to them? They say family is a safe harbor, but the ones who taught me to walk tried to break my legs. This was a calculated heist orchestrated by my own father. He forgot one detail. When you strip a woman of everything, she does not cry. She learns the rules and flips the entire board. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. I am 34 years old. My entire existence has been constructed around logic, load-bearing walls, and measurable variables. As a senior structural engineer at Centex Biostructures, a specialized technology corporation designing fully self-sustaining ecological reserves, I deal in absolute truths. Steel bends at specific temperatures, concrete cracks under precise pressure. People, however, are far less predictable and infinitely more dangerous. I built a quiet, isolated, and highly functional life for myself in the freezing, remote altitudes of Colorado. I liked the biting cold of the mountains. It kept the fragile and the fake away from my front door. The foundation of my formidable independence solidified exactly 6 months ago when Arthur passed away. Arthur was not my biological father, but he was the only true mentor and parent I ever recognized in this life. He taught me how to read blueprints before I could drive. In his final will, he left me a vast expanse of undeveloped land in the northern mountains. This was not just dirt and pine trees. The land sat on a verified, massive deposit of rare earth minerals. That alone was an unimaginable fortune. Add to that the 2 structural technology patents I had engineered from scratch and solely own. Those patents are conservatively valued in the tens of millions of dollars. I never cared about the luxury the money could buy. I drove an old truck and wore heavy boots. I cared only about the impenetrable autonomy that wealth provided. But wealth is a beacon, and like scavengers smelling a fresh hunt, my biological family materialized from the shadows. Marcus, my father, is a smug former stockbroker whose arrogance always outpaced his actual intelligence. He suddenly remembered my phone number after years of total silence. Harper, my younger sister, is a woman whose entire existence revolves around funding an extravagant lifestyle for her social media followers while perpetually playing the victim. She started sending me daily messages. They visited my cabin. They brought expensive coffee. They feigned deep concern over my long, grueling working hours. For a few fleeting weeks, against all my better judgment, I almost let myself believe the delusion that they wanted to reconcile after over a decade of bitter estrangement. I should have trusted my instincts. The fragile illusion shattered on a perfectly ordinary Friday afternoon. I had just driven home after a 14-hour shift inspecting a high-stress biodome prototype. The snow was beginning to fall heavily outside my cabin, painting the world in a blinding, suffocating white. Pinned to my heavy oak front door was a thick manila envelope delivered by a court processor. It was an emergency court summons. As I broke the thick wax seal and began to read the dense legal jargon, the temperature in the room seemed to drop to freezing. The air was sucked out of my lungs. Marcus and Harper had jointly filed an emergency petition for a full, unmitigated conservatorship over my person and my entire estate. I read the words over and over, my vision narrowing into a dark tunnel. They were asserting, under penalty of perjury, that I was suffering from severe, rapidly progressing neurocognitive decline. The fabricated cause they presented to the court was prolonged toxic chemical exposure from the experimental bioresins used at Centex Biostructures. The petition boldly claimed I was experiencing violent, paranoid delusions, that I could no longer manage my basic personal hygiene, and that I was completely incapacitated regarding all financial and legal decisions. They painted a heartbreaking, entirely fictional picture of a mad woman hoarding millions of dollars in the isolated mountains, a tragic danger to herself and society. Through this legal maneuver, they were asking the judge to strip me of my bodily autonomy, freeze my bank accounts, take control of my property, and hijack my life's work. My phone vibrated violently against the kitchen counter, shattering the silence. The illuminated screen displayed Marcus's name. I stared at the glowing letters for 3 long rings before slowly sliding my finger across the glass to answer. I did not speak. I simply held the device to my ear, listening to the heavy, calculating breathing on the other end of the line. "Sweetheart," Marcus said. His voice dripped with a sick, rehearsed sympathy, thick and suffocating like cheap syrup. "I know you are probably very confused by the paperwork you just received. Do not be scared. I just want to protect you from yourself, daughter. We are going to get you the help you need." I calmly ended the call and placed the phone face down on the counter. The silence in my cabin was no longer peaceful. It was deafening and electric. They did not want to help me. They wanted to lock me in a permanent legal cage and swallow my entire fortune whole. They thought my introverted silence was a sign of weakness. They thought my grief over Arthur would make me crumble. They forgot who they were dealing with. I am a structural engineer. I look at a towering, corrupt structure, and I know exactly where to place the explosives to bring the whole thing crashing down. I needed a weapon, and in the legal system, a weapon wears a tailored suit and charges by the minute. By Monday morning, I was sitting across a sleek mahogany desk from Elias Vance. Elias was a defense attorney who specialized in tearing apart fraudulent guardianships. He did not offer me pity, which was exactly why I hired him. He only offered brutal surgical strategy. As we began pulling apart the massive stack of filings my father had submitted to the court, the true sickening depth of the betrayal came into focus. Marcus had not acted on a sudden impulse of concern. The metadata on the drafted petitions and the dates of the preliminary emails between his legal team showed this machine had been grinding into motion exactly 6 months ago. The timeline perfectly aligned with the week Arthur received his terminal diagnosis. While I had been spending my nights sitting beside Arthur in the hospital hospice ward, watching the only true father figure I had ever known slowly slip away, Marcus was actively measuring the drapes of my estate. The court file was a masterclass in calculated character assassination. Marcus had submitted dozens of sworn affidavits to the judge. As Elias read them aloud, my stomach turned to stone. They had tracked down old college acquaintances I had not spoken to in nearly 15 years, and undoubtedly through quiet financial incentives, convinced them to testify under oath that I had a history of severe paranoia. There were detailed, fabricated accounts of me supposedly having psychotic breaks. But the crown jewel of their manufactured evidence was a comprehensive medical evaluation signed by a prominent neurospecialist based in Denver. The report confidently diagnosed me with aggressive, early-onset chemical dementia. I stared at the signature on the thick medical file in utter disgust. I had never been in the same room as this doctor, let alone allowed him to examine my brain. They used the very traits that made me successful to paint me as an insane, vulnerable target. My dedication to my craft became their greatest weapon. They took my grueling 80-hour work weeks and twisted them into manic, obsessive episodes. They took my preference for a quiet, solitary life in the mountains and labeled it as dangerous social isolation and severe agoraphobia. In their narrative, I was not an independent, self-made woman engineering the future. I was a tragic, decaying spinster who had lost her grip on reality and was primed to be exploited by strangers. The crushing weight of their trap clamped down on my reality 24 hours later. I was standing in a local hardware store to buy some basic supplies, and when I handed the clerk my primary credit card, the machine beeped a loud, aggressive red. Declined. I tried my secondary debit card. Declined. A cold sweat prickled the back of my neck. I stepped outside into the freezing air and called my bank. A monotonous customer service representative informed me that a temporary emergency judicial freeze had been placed on all of my personal and business accounts pending the upcoming competency hearing. The isolation was brutal and instantaneous. I was a millionaire who could not even afford a tank of gas. The freeze was a tactical strike meant to paralyze me, explicitly designed to ensure I could not afford to pay Elias his mandatory $50,000 legal retainer. They wanted me to walk into that courtroom defenseless and alone. Fortunately, Arthur had taught me to always keep a physical emergency reserve for the worst-case scenarios in life. I drove back to my cabin, pulled up a loose floorboard in the pantry, and counted out exactly $50,000 in crisp bills I had stored in a fireproof lockbox. I drove straight back to Elias and dropped the heavy stacks of cash directly onto his desk. We were staying in the fight. While Marcus aggressively attacked my finances, Harper launched a relentless assault on my public image. My sister, who had not remembered my birthday in over a decade, suddenly transformed into a grieving saint on the internet. She posted heavily edited, tear-stained videos to her hundreds of thousands of followers. She stared directly into the camera, dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, whispering about how agonizing it was to watch her brilliant older sister lose her mind to toxic chemicals. She created a pathetic, cinematic narrative of a family desperately trying to save a loved one from the brink of insanity. The public devoured the performance. Thousands of comments poured in, offering prayers and praising Harper for her bravery and devotion. She was weaponizing public sympathy, creating a massive wave of external pressure on the legal system to rule in their favor. The average person would have shattered under this coordinated psychological warfare. They expected me to scream, to lash out, to call them in a blind rage, or to post furious, frantic rebuttals online. They desperately needed me to act crazy to prove their point to the judge. I gave them absolutely nothing. I severed all emotional connections to the people I once called family and entered a state of absolute, unbreakable discipline. I locked my doors. I maintained my total silence. I did not log onto the internet. Instead, I cleared off my massive drafting table, pinning the court documents to the board like architectural blueprints. I am an engineer. Everything in this world, even a complex lie, has a structural framework. I just had to find the stress points in their foundation, apply the exact right amount of pressure, and watch their entire scheme collapse under its own weight. We had spent the first 72 hours playing defense. In structural engineering, if you only reinforce a failing wall, you are just delaying the inevitable collapse. To truly neutralize a threat, you have to go on the offensive and destroy the force pushing against it. I sat in Elias's office on a gray Tuesday morning and told him to stop looking at my medical history. I told him we needed to look at their bank accounts. Fraud on this scale always requires a massive, desperate financial motive. Elias smiled grimly, picked up his phone, and hired a highly aggressive, independent forensic financial investigator. We needed someone who could rip through corporate shell companies and offshore accounts like a buzzsaw. Within 48 hours, the polished, wealthy facade my father had maintained for his entire life began to disintegrate under the investigator's scrutiny. Marcus always projected the image of a Wall Street titan, wearing custom suits and driving imported cars. The reality was a terrifying house of cards on the verge of a catastrophic implosion. His primary investment fund was practically bankrupt. He had heavily leveraged client money into a series of disastrous commercial real estate ventures that had completely folded. But the most chilling discovery was not the sheer incompetence, it was who he had turned to for a bailout. Our investigator uncovered that Marcus was drowning in $15 million of extremely toxic bad debt. These were not standard bank loans. He had borrowed millions from unregulated shadow creditors operating in the criminal underworld. We found encrypted messages threatening severe physical violence against Marcus if he did not liquidate assets to cover the $15 million within the next 90 days. My father was not trying to steal my fortune out of simple greed. He was backed into a corner by ruthless criminals, and he was using my life as a human shield to save his own skin. Harper's financial reality was equally pathetic. Behind the glossy filters, the sponsored posts, and the fake tears she shed for me online, she was drowning in a spectacular ocean of debt. She had racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in high-interest credit card debt just to maintain the illusion of an elite influencer lifestyle, but that was merely a misdemeanor compared to her real crime. Her highly publicized, supposedly revolutionary wellness tech startup was nothing but an elaborate shell game. Our investigator discovered that she had falsified user data to secure venture capital funding, and a federal regulatory agency was secretly preparing to launch a massive fraud investigation into her company. She needed millions of dollars of instant, untraceable cash to refund the angry investors before they filed criminal charges and sent her to federal prison. They were both staring down the barrel of total ruin, and I was their only ticket to salvation. The absolute breakthrough, the undeniable smoking gun that connected all of these desperate pieces together, arrived late on Thursday night. Our investigator managed to penetrate a secured cloud server Marcus used for his private negotiations. Hidden deep within a folder labeled with a generic project name was a highly confidential 40-page draft contract. It was a preliminary acquisition agreement with Apex Lithium, a massive, aggressive private mining corporation known for exploiting rare earth deposits. As I read through the dense legal clauses, the blood froze in my veins. There, listed explicitly under the section titled Projected Collateral, were the exact geographic coordinates of the mountain land Arthur had left me. Right beneath that, detailed with horrifying precision, were the registration numbers for my 2 proprietary structural technology patents. Marcus had pre-sold my entire life. The contract was contingent upon a single pending legal condition. That condition was Marcus acquiring full signatory authority over my estate via a successful judicial conservatorship. The tragic neurocognitive decline they had fabricated was nothing but a theatrical performance for the court. If they could convince the judge that I had lost my mind, Marcus would be appointed my legal guardian. He would gain the absolute, unquestioned power to sign that Apex Lithium contract, instantly liquidating my land and my patents to generate the tens of millions of dollars required to pay off his underworld creditors and buy Harper's way out of federal prison. The sheer, calculated psychopathy of their plan was breathtaking. They were perfectly willing to have me legally declared insane, chemically restrained, and locked in a psychiatric facility for the rest of my natural life, all so they could pay their debts. But a scheme this elaborate required accomplices, and accomplices always leave a paper trail. I turned my attention to the prominent Denver neurologist who had signed the damning medical evaluation declaring me incompetent. I used my own technical background in systems analysis to track the digital breadcrumbs surrounding his private practice. It took me a grueling 12 hours of digging through public vendor databases and cross-referencing obscure corporate registrations, but I finally hit the jackpot. I intercepted a series of highly encrypted emails, bouncing between a shell company controlled by Marcus and an offshore consulting firm registered in the name of the doctor's wife. The emails detailed a strict payment schedule. Attached to the final message was a confirmation receipt for a wire transfer of $250,000. It was categorized as a vague consulting fee, but the date of the transfer matched the exact day the doctor had signed my fabricated dementia diagnosis. My father had literally bought my insanity for $250,000. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screens illuminating the dark room. I possessed every single piece of their puzzle. I had the motive, the mechanism, and the undeniable proof of the bribery. Any normal person would have immediately run to the police or handed the evidence straight to the judge to stop the hearing. But I did not want to just stop them. I wanted them to walk so far into their own trap that the doors of federal prison would lock securely behind them. I sat across from Elias, the thick file of damning evidence resting between us like an unexploded bomb. He reached for it, ready to file an immediate emergency injunction to crush their petition before we ever saw the inside of a courtroom. I placed my hand firmly over his wrist. I told him we were not going to show the judge our hand. Not yet. Beating them in a preliminary hearing would only force them to retreat, regroup, and try again from a different, perhaps more dangerous angle. I did not want a simple dismissal. I wanted an absolute massacre. We were going to let Marcus and Harper walk into the courtroom, place their hands on a Bible, and commit federal perjury on the public record. If we let them present their forged documents to a sitting judge as the absolute truth, their civil scheme would instantly cross the threshold into severe, undeniable criminal fraud. Elias leaned back in his leather chair, slowly lowered his pen, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. To make the trap completely inescapable, I needed to make them arrogant. Predators always get sloppy when they think the prey has finally given up the fight. Late that evening, I sat at my kitchen table and drafted an email to Harper. I deliberately misspelled a few words and broke my usual precise grammar. I wrote that I was feeling overwhelmingly exhausted, that my memory was slipping exactly like they said it was, and that the relentless pressure of the court case was finally breaking me. I apologized for shutting them out of my life. I typed out a pathetic surrender, stating I was willing to sign a limited power of attorney over my daily expenses just to make the headache stop. It was a masterfully crafted message, designed to feed directly into their colossal egos and validate their entirely false narrative. They took the bait with a sickening, predictable desperation. Blinded by their own greed and the rapidly approaching deadlines from Marcus's underworld creditors, they completely abandoned all legal caution. Instead of simply accepting the minor concessions I offered in the email, Marcus pushed his legal team into overdrive. Within 48 hours, his attorneys had drafted a massive stack of permanent, irrevocable asset transfer documents. They did exactly what I had engineered them to do. They aggressively filed these newly drafted contracts into the official court docket, pre-attaching them to the conservatorship petition so they would be ready for the judge's immediate signature the moment I was legally declared incompetent. By formally submitting those specific liquidation documents to the court, Marcus had legally cemented his intent to steal my estate. The snare was pulled tight. There was no stepping back for him now. While they were busy counting the millions of dollars they did not yet own, I was quietly building an impenetrable fortress of medical truth. I flew out of state under a disguised travel itinerary and subjected myself to the most rigorous cognitive evaluations available in modern medicine. Over the course of 3 exhausting days, spanning nearly 30 hours of active examination, I sat before 3 separate, nationally renowned neurologists. Every single written test, every brain scan, every psychological interview was meticulously recorded by independent, third-party videographers to guarantee there could be no future accusations of manipulation. The results were unanimous and definitive. My brain was not just perfectly healthy. My cognitive function, memory retention, and analytical processing speeds were testing in the top 1% of my age group. The fraudulent dementia diagnosis Marcus had purchased was about to be obliterated by bulletproof, objective science. Next, I systematically dismantled the foundational lie of their entire case, the toxic chemical exposure. I placed a highly confidential call to the internal security director at Centex Biostructures. As a senior engineer, I maintained top-tier security clearance. I requested a comprehensive, certified extraction of my daily occupational safety reports, covering the last 5 years of my employment. The corporate office provided thousands of pages of environmental sensor logs from my specific biodome laboratories, cross-referenced directly with my mandatory weekly biometric health screenings. The data proved irrefutably that the air I breathed at work was filtered to a pristine clinical purity level. There were 0 hazardous chemicals, 0 toxic bioresins, and absolutely 0 heavy metals in my biological system. My father had built his entire legal strategy on a fictional poison, and I now held the certified corporate laboratory results to prove his lie. Every single piece of the puzzle was flawlessly locked into place. The morning of the hearing finally arrived, bringing with it a bitterly cold, completely clear sky. I dressed with the cold precision of a soldier preparing for a final deployment. I chose a dark, sharply tailored suit that projected absolute, unbreakable authority. When I arrived at the massive stone steps of the county courthouse, Elias was waiting for me near the pillars. He looked at my face and nodded just once. There was no fear in my chest. There was no anxiety clouding my mind. There was only the cold, terrifying calm of a predator watching its prey step willingly onto the trapdoor. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courtroom, fully prepared to watch my family destroy themselves. The atmosphere inside courtroom number 4 was suffocating. The air conditioning hummed a low, monotonous drone that seemed to amplify the tension. I sat perfectly still beside Elias at the heavy oak defense table, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Across the wide center aisle, Marcus and Harper sat flanked by their high-priced legal team. They had dressed meticulously for the occasion, wearing conservative, muted gray and navy fabrics entirely designed to project an image of a humble, grieving family enduring an unbearable tragedy. When the Honorable Judge Thomas Harrison, a man known for his strict decorum, finally emerged from his chambers and took his high seat at the bench, the theatrical performance officially commenced. Marcus's lead attorney, a slick, sharply featured man with a voice smooth enough to sell poison as medicine, immediately took the floor for his opening statement. For 30 agonizing, uninterrupted minutes, he paced deliberately back and forth before the judge, weaving a masterful and utterly devastating narrative. He spoke of me not as a highly capable professional engineer, but as a tragic, broken shell of a human being. He weaponized words like pitiful, deteriorating, and desperately vulnerable, letting them echo in the silent room. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of a brilliant mind slowly being devoured by unseen, relentless chemical toxins, emphasizing heavily that I was now completely incapable of protecting myself from the harsh, predatory realities of the modern world. He expertly framed my father and sister as the ultimate, selfless saviors who were reluctantly stepping into the breach at great personal emotional cost, solely to guide me back to the light. The true pinnacle of their sickening play occurred when Marcus was formally called to the witness stand. My father stood, raised his right hand, swore a solemn, binding oath before God and the court to tell the whole truth under penalty of perjury, and sat down. He looked directly up at the judge, his face a perfect molded mask of deep paternal agony. As his own lawyer gently and respectfully questioned him about my supposed rapid decline, Marcus actually began to weep. Genuine, heavy, glistening tears pooled in his eyes and spilled slowly over his lower eyelids. His voice cracked with a perfectly calibrated, manufactured emotion as he described how it broke his aging heart into 1,000 jagged pieces to watch his brilliant eldest daughter completely self-destruct. He spoke softly of long, sleepless nights spent pacing his floor, agonizing over my safety in the freezing, isolated mountains. It was an absolutely flawless, award-winning performance. I watched carefully as Judge Harrison's stern face began to soften. The judge leaned forward on his elbows, his posture physically reflecting genuine judicial compassion for a desperate father trying to save his profoundly sick child. Through every single agonizing second of it, I did not flinch. I did not glare or scoff. I sat with a spine forged of rigid steel, my expression locked into an impenetrable, absolute wall of ice. I held a sleek black pen and calmly took meticulous, perfectly legible handwritten notes on a yellow legal pad. Every single deliberate lie, every carefully fabricated emotional anecdote, every single tear shed under the heavy weight of a federal oath was permanently recorded in my notebook. I was deliberately affording them the means to orchestrate their own utter ruin. I watched them scale their fragile peak of perjury, keenly aware that the further they ascended, the more catastrophic and inescapable their impending collapse would prove. Emboldened by the judge's steady, affirming nods, Marcus's counsel boldly closed in for the final blow. He advanced directly to the wooden rail of the bench, his tone swelling into an insistent, authoritative climax. He boldly requested that the court completely bypass all standard mandatory waiting periods and psychological evaluation delays due to the extreme, life-threatening nature of my supposed delusions. He demanded an immediate, permanent, and total freezing of all my corporate shares and intellectual property rights. He formally requested that absolute legal and financial control of my entire estate be instantly transferred into a blind trust, a trust conveniently and exclusively managed by Marcus. They were reaching their greedy hands directly into my vault, right in plain sight of the judge. Then, the heavy courtroom fell completely silent as Judge Harrison slowly turned his attention down to our defense table. He respectfully asked Elias if the defense wished to call any opposing medical experts to the stand to rebut the severe neurological claims presented today. Elias stood up slowly, deliberately buttoning his suit jacket with a terrifying, calculated calm. He did not look over at Marcus. He did not acknowledge the opposing counsel. He walked smoothly to the center of the room and spoke in a clear, resonant voice that instantly shattered the melodramatic, suffocating atmosphere. "Your Honor," Elias began, his tone entirely devoid of panic or defensiveness, "the defense will not be calling any medical witnesses to the stand today. We firmly believe we do not need to debate the current state of my client's brain, because this petition before you has absolutely nothing to do with her health." A low, confused murmur rippled through the sparse gallery behind us. The judge frowned deeply, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Elias approached the bench, carrying a single thick, bright red folder. "Instead of medical records, Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests that you immediately review a highly sensitive supplemental financial dossier that we officially filed into the sealed court docket at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." Across the wide aisle, I saw Harper lean over and whisper something excitedly to Marcus. A slow, deeply arrogant, and entirely triumphant smile spread across my father's face. He looked across the room at me with an expression of overwhelming, sickening pity. In his greedy mind, Elias's shocking refusal to call a defending doctor was a public admission of total defeat. They genuinely believed my lawyer was desperately grasping at thin straws, throwing entirely meaningless financial paperwork at a brick wall in a pathetic final attempt to delay the inevitable judgment. They thought they had undeniably won the war. They had absolutely no idea that the entire floor beneath them was about to give way entirely. Judge Harrison adjusted his heavy wire-rimmed glasses, his brow furrowed in severe confusion, and opened the bright red folder Elias had placed before him. The courtroom was so incredibly quiet that the crisp sound of the heavy paper turning echoed against the wood-paneled walls. Elias began his systematic, ruthless demolition of my family. He directed the judge to the first section of the dossier. It was the certified, irrefutable medical clearance I had secretly acquired over the past week. Elias calmly explained that the documents contained 30 hours of rigorous cognitive testing, conducted by 3 independent, nationally recognized neurologists, complete with third-party video verification. The results proved my brain function was resting securely in the top 1% of my age demographic. I watched the slick, highly paid attorney representing my father. The smug, confident posture he had maintained for the past hour vanished in an instant. He leaned forward, frantically flipping through his own copy of the defense filings, desperately searching for a loophole that did not exist. But Elias was not finished. The medical report was merely the appetizer, a simple decoy to shatter their credibility before delivering the fatal blow. Elias instructed the judge to turn to the second tab. The atmosphere in the room shifted from tense to physically suffocating. Elias presented the unredacted copy of the secret Apex Lithium draft contract, highlighting the exact clauses where Marcus had illegally pledged my mountain estate and my 2 proprietary structural technology patents as collateral. He explicitly detailed my father's $15 million shadow debt to the criminal underworld. Then, he delivered the absolute kill shot. Elias submitted the encrypted banking receipts proving a direct, undeniable wire transfer of $250,000 from a shell corporation controlled by Marcus directly into the offshore account of the Denver neurologist who had signed my fabricated dementia diagnosis. Judge Harrison's face transformed. The sympathetic, gentle expression of a man comforting a grieving father evaporated, replaced by the terrifying cold fury of a tricked judicial officer. The veins in his neck visibly darkened. A heavy, glistening bead of sweat rolled slowly down the temple of Marcus's lead attorney. The lawyer realized the catastrophic reality of the situation. His client had not just lied to him. His client had used him to present a heavily fabricated case to a sitting judge. In a desperate act of self-preservation, the attorney slowly closed his leather briefcase and physically took 2 steps away from my father. Marcus saw his lawyer retreat. He saw the terrifying, disgusted glare directed at him from the high bench. The meticulously crafted mask of the heartbroken parent shattered completely, revealing the cornered, rabid animal underneath. Panic and pure, unfiltered rage hijacked his nervous system. My father lost all grip on reality. He leaped out of his heavy oak chair, his face contorted into a vicious, ugly snarl. He slammed both of his fists down onto the defense table with a violently loud crash that made the court reporter physically jump. He extended a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. "Take everything she owns!" Marcus screamed, his voice echoing hysterically off the high ceiling. Spittle flew from his lips. "She is crazy! Transfer the property rights to me immediately!" He was completely unhinged, blinded by the terrifying realization that his underworld creditors were going to destroy him. But Judge Harrison did not even flinch at the outburst. The judge simply stared down at the final page of the red dossier. His hands gripped the edges of the paper so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. It was the final devastating piece of evidence Elias had unearthed. A prior mortgage document Marcus had submitted to his shadow creditors to temporarily delay his execution, a document that prominently featured the forged, authenticated signature of a sitting federal judge. A dead absolute silence fell over the entire courtroom, heavy and suffocating like a thick wool blanket. Judge Harrison slowly raised his head. His face was a mask of absolute, unadulterated judicial wrath. He picked up his heavy wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a violent, cracking force that sounded like a gunshot. "Suspend the court immediately," Judge Harrison commanded, his voice booming with a terrifying, absolute authority. He pointed a rigid finger at the 2 armed officers standing near the exits. "Bailiffs, lock the doors. No one is allowed to leave." The heavy metal locks of the courtroom doors clicked shut with a loud, final echo. Judge Harrison reached down and ripped the internal emergency phone from its cradle on the bench. He did not take his burning eyes off my father. "Call courthouse security immediately and contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation," the judge barked into the receiver. "We have bank fraud, federal document forgery, and perjury right in this room." The color completely drained from Marcus's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed heavily back into his chair, gasping for air like a dying fish. Beside him, the fragile alliance of convenience instantly disintegrated. Harper, realizing her own freedom was now in critical jeopardy, completely broke down. She burst into hysterical, hyperventilating tears, dramatically waving her hands and screaming at the top of her lungs that she knew nothing about the money, loudly blaming her father for manipulating her into the entire scheme. It was a pathetic, chaotic display of cowardly rats turning on each other as the ship went down. 2 large, heavily armed security officers marched straight down the center aisle. They grabbed Marcus by his expensive suit jacket, hauled him roughly to his feet, and forcefully wrenched his arms behind his back. The cold, sharp click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard. I stood up slowly from the defense table. I reached down and calmly buttoned the center button of my tailored vest, smoothing out a microscopic wrinkle in the dark fabric. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply picked up my notebook and began to walk toward the back of the courtroom. I stepped directly past my father. He was trembling violently, his eyes pleading silently for a mercy he never intended to show me. I looked at him, and my eyes were completely, beautifully empty. I felt absolutely no pity, no sadness, and no regret. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the grand hallway, the heavy locks disengaging to let me pass. I walked out of the massive stone building and stood at the top of the courthouse steps, taking a deep, freezing breath of the crisp Colorado air. The bright, blinding morning sun washed over my face. I stood there in the absolute, unbreakable quiet of my freedom, knowing with absolute certainty that my intellect, my fortune, and my life, permanently, belonged to me. The structural integrity of my world was finally perfectly sound. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.